burning flesh, screaming crowds, starving lions tearing prisoners apart while emperors laughed. This wasn't a nightmare, it was daily entertainment in ancient Rome. And the truth about what happened in the Colosseum is far worse than the history books admit. By the end of this video, you'll know how Rome's arenas turned cruelty into spectacle, spectacle into politics, and politics into one of the most inhumane systems of control the world has ever seen. In 264 BC, 3 pairs of slaves fought to the death at a funeral. It was called a munus, a solemn duty to honor the dead. Yet what began as sacred ritual soon twisted into something far darker. By the late 3rd century BC, however, private duels had moved from grave sites to festivals, and eventually into Rome's state-sponsored games. As politicians realized that blood could buy power, death itself became politics. What began as a handful of fighters gradually evolved into an industrial machine of horror that consumed hundreds of thousands of lives. And this was only the beginning. Picture this. Every morning, a Roman citizen could go to the arena to watch executions take place before an afternoon of actual gladiatorial combat. The iron gate groaned open, and consequently, silence fell over the crowd. From the shadows of the arena tunnel, a lone figure emerged, barefoot, half-naked, carrying nothing but a short blade. Across the sand, meanwhile, the cage door rose. A lion, ribs pressing against matted fur, stepped out into the sunlight, starved, alert, and coiled with hunger. This was Damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to beasts. By the 1st century CE, Roman arenas had become theaters not only of human combat, but also of man's forced confrontation with wild beasts. The condemned, criminals, prisoners of war, and sometimes even rebellious slaves, were thrown into the arena against lions, leopards, or bears, often weakened by hunger to ensure a swift and violent end. But here's what they don't tell you about the swift death. It is reported that it was seldom necessary for 2 beasts to be required to take down 1 man. On the contrary, 1 beast frequently dispatched several men. Furthermore, Cicero mentions a single lion, which alone dispatched 200 bestiarii. The Roman philosopher Seneca recorded prisoners who would rather die by their own hand than face this terror. For instance, Seneca relates that a German prisoner, rather than participate, killed himself by forcing a sponge used in the lavatory down his throat. Wait until you see how they made sure the animals would actually attack. The animal was trained to be confident and aggressive towards humans, where the aggression he learned was specifically associated with a training area resembling the arena. In many cases, though, they must have been sent into the arena with little training due to constraints of time. In cases such as these, therefore, the unprepared beasts sometimes had to be driven to fight by trainers armed with whips, flails with lead balls, hot irons, and burning firebrands. But the systematic horror was just beginning. What came next made Damnatio ad bestias look like mercy. A tunica molesta was a tunic impregnated with pitch and other flammable substances such as naphtha or resin. This was then put upon the victim while the neck of the victim was fixed to a stake with an iron collar. It was then ignited, burning the victim alive. Picture the most horrifying scene your mind can conjure. Now realize it was worse. Death was not swift. Instead, it was the torment of the slow burn that was the norm. Tacitus states that during the first persecution of Christians under the reign of Nero, after the Great Fire of Rome in AD 64, people were wrapped in animal skins and thrown to dogs. But Nero wasn't satisfied with just animal attacks. The picture is The Christian Martyr's Last Prayer, 1883, by Jean-Léon Gérôme, where the figures are smeared in pitch and being set alight, calling to mind the cruelty of Nero who set Christians alight in his gardens to serve as human torches. Tertullian wrote, "We are called faggot fellows and half-axle men, because we are tied to a half-axle post and faggots are piled around us, and we are burnt." Here's what makes it truly insane. The tunica molesta could have been an alternative means of execution that still provided a certain degree of entertainment while being relatively cheap with a guaranteed result. Afterwards, moreover, the charred corpse was dragged by a hook throughout the arena for spectators to see, although historian David Kyle writes that only the corpses of the hated and dangerous were treated this way. But here's where the hypocrisy gets even worse. It was actually a Christian emperor, Justinian, who decreed that heretics would be put to death by fire as part of his Codex Justiniani, ratifying the decrees of his predecessors. The very people who had been burned alive for their beliefs later used the same method on others. But the Romans weren't content with just burning people. They had to turn murder into theater. By the time of the Colosseum's grand opening in AD 80, executions were no longer merely punitive, they were theatrical. Emperors, beginning with Titus, used the midday break between gladiator matches to stage mythological tortures. These were not symbolic dramatizations. They were, instead, real deaths, designed to mirror the agonies of legendary figures. Martial, the poet and eyewitness to those inaugural games, recorded what he saw. He described an Orpheus figure entering the arena to enchant wild beasts with song. But unlike the myth, where nature bends to Orpheus's music, the arena's animals were uncharmed. A bear mauled the performer on cue. But here's the detail that historians tried to suppress. One of the most disturbing reenactments was the myth of Pasiphae, the Cretan queen cursed to lust after a bull. Roman crowds witnessed a woman, or possibly a condemned man disguised, thrown to a beast in a twisted imitation of her fate. If such a reenactment did occur, the condemned would have appeared wearing the hide of a cow. Coleman suggests that the only way a bull would have actually mounted a woman was if the condemned had been smeared with the scent of a cow in season. Martial, with biting irony, wrote, "How you must wish you had your feathers now," about a man playing Daedalus who was ripped apart by a beast instead of flying to safety. And this reveals something terrifying about Roman society. Martial appears to encourage readers to believe that the spectacle was true in order to give the emperor power over the myth itself. Writing, "Believe in Pasiphae joined to the Cretan bull. We have seen it. The old story is believable." They weren't just killing people. They were rewriting reality itself. But we haven't even reached the most disturbing professional in Roman history. It is in this era that Rome saw the rise of its most famous bestiarius, Carpophorus, the king of the beasts. He triumphed in one match that pitted him against a bear, a lion, and a leopard, all of which were released to attack him at once. Another time, furthermore, he killed 20 separate animals in one battle, using only his bare hands as weapons. But Carpophorus had another talent that historians barely mention. Perhaps most shockingly, it was said that he was among the few bestiarii who could command animals to rape human beings, including bulls, zebras, stallions, wild boars, and giraffes, among others. This crowd-pleasing trick allowed his editors to create ludi meridiani that could not only combine sex and death, but also claim to be honoring the god Jupiter. Carpophorus trained multiple animals, including giraffes, to rape women. To accomplish this, Carpophorus would wait for female animals to be in heat, so he could collect samples from them to arouse the male of the species. Carpophorus would then rub these samples against slaves or homeless women he'd tempted to the arena. Here's the truly insane part. According to one account, Carpophorus used up several women before he got the animals properly trained. One story involves a woman accused of poisoning 5 being raped by a jackass, before Carpophorus ended the ordeal by releasing wild animals into the arena to ease her suffering. But the systematic nature of this horror reveals something even more disturbing about Roman society. As their reputations grew, bestiarii were given the power to independently devise new and even more audacious spectacles for the ludi meridiani, midday executions. And by the time the Roman games had grown popular enough to fill 250,000-seat arenas, consequently, the work of the bestiarii had become a twisted art form. What happened next pushed the boundaries of human cruelty beyond anything we've discussed. The water glistened under the Roman sun, calm for only a moment. Then, drums thundered, war horns cut through the air, and 2 full fleets surged toward each other across a man-made lake. Soldiers stood on triremes armed with spears and catapults. Below them, meanwhile, thousands cheered, not from riverbanks, but from stone bleachers. Rome called them naumachii, mock naval battles fought not in distant seas, but in carefully engineered basins, often dug by imperial order. Julius Caesar staged the first in 46 BC. Near the Tiber, he had an artificial lake excavated to reenact a battle between Tyrian and Egyptian fleets. Real ships, real weapons, and real men, condemned prisoners, who fought not as actors, but as soldiers with no hope of survival. But here's what makes it truly horrifying. Augustus constructed an enormous basin in 2 BC, measuring 1,800 by 1,200 Roman feet, so vast it required its own aqueduct, the Aqua Alsiatina, to fill it. On those waters, 30 warships clashed, each manned by convicted criminals numbering in the thousands. In AD 52, Emperor Claudius drained a mountain lake, Fucine, and celebrated with a naumachia. The fighters greeted him with words etched into history. Morituri te salutant. Those who are about to die salute you. Whether those words were scripted or desperate, they captured the fatalism of men sent to die for public amusement. And this reveals the true scale of Roman industrial murder. Even under Trajan, a century after Caesar, the tradition endured. He constructed the Naumachia Vaticana in AD 109, a massive flooded arena near the Vatican Hill, where more battles of spectacle and death played out before roaring crowds. Each Naumachia was more than a performance. It was a demonstration of total control, of water, of men, of empire. The Romans didn't just kill, they systematically stripped away every shred of human dignity first. The 2 young women, Perpetua and a slave girl Felicitas, were reserved as a finale to the executions to face a wild cow. Since it was thought that public nudity would not cast doubt on their fidelity, further degradation was added by not only fully exposing them to the beast, but also using one of their own sex rather than the usual male animal. After having all their clothing removed, Perpetua and Felicitas were driven into the arena covered only in see-through netting. As this proved too much for the crowd, however, they were brought back to be clothed in plain loose garments before being sent in again to face the beast. But here's what makes this systematically evil. The implication was that the women were shown as not being women enough to commit adultery. This is also not the only instance of such treatment being used on Christian women. Many also customarily subjected to other punishments and harsh tortures beforehand. And the crowd's reaction reveals something terrifying about Roman society. Even an audience accustomed to watching people torn apart by wild animals found complete nudity too much. But only temporarily. They were perfectly comfortable watching the same women die once they were partially clothed. The sheer quantity of slaughter in the Colosseum saw the number of lions, jaguars, and tigers plummet across the globe. According to some, Roman hunting absolutely devastated the wildlife of North Africa and the entire Mediterranean region, wiping some species of animal off the map entirely. For example, after one particularly brutal set of games, in which 9,000 animals were slaughtered, the hippo disappeared from the river Nile. Overall, it's estimated that an incredible 400,000 people were condemned to die in Roman arenas over the centuries. If one extends that number to the 250 amphitheaters built all over the Roman Empire, the number of the dead multiplies by thousands. But here's the most disturbing psychological aspect. Although public executions were felt by nearly everyone to serve an important social function and few pitied those in the arena, it was thought disturbing to take too much pleasure in the executions, as the Emperor Claudius did. Claudius was constantly giving gladiatorial munera, for he took great pleasure in them, and he even aroused criticism because of this. Even Romans thought there was something wrong with enjoying it too much. Yet the system continued for centuries. Not every Roman cheered. The philosopher Seneca warned that the arena corrupted the crowd itself. I came expecting entertainment, but left more cruel and inhuman, simply because I had been among human beings. And the Christian writer Tertullian asked the dangerous question: who can guarantee it is always the guilty who are thrown to the beasts? Even in Rome, some voices recoiled. They couldn't stop the games, but they left us a record of unease, a reminder that cruelty was never normal. Rome's arenas weren't about glory. They were machines of state power, turning death into politics and cruelty into spectacle. By reducing humans to torches, prey, or mythological victims, the empire proved it could strip away every shred of dignity. The true horror wasn't just the killings in the sand, but the way centuries of spectators learned to cheer for them. Which of these systematic horrors reveals the most about how power uses spectacle to maintain control?